Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to Overtime. With me today is Zandering, and let's get started with what we're going to discuss today. Now, a North Carolina-based hospital system has fired roughly 175 employees yesterday for failing to comply with the organization's mandatory vaccination policy. Last week, 375 employees at the Novant health system were suspended and given 1 week to comply or be fired. And what I'm seeing here suggests I may be muted, so I'm going to quickly check my mic. No, my mic should be on. So if you guys could let me know whether or not you can hear me in the chat. I'm just going to double check. This is saying that the audio is not going out. All right, and then, okay, so Sinister's report. Yeah, this is showing that the audio is not going out. So let me just quickly check. On bus C. I do apologize for this. Okay, what I'm going to do is well, I'm not going to apologize while they can hear me. Okay, you know what I think happened? So let's see, audio. All right, well, I could do just, well, okay, hopefully that's going to work. Look at one more thing, just to make sure that that's working, and then, yeah, this says it should be working. That's really bizarre. I've never seen this precise time. Unfortunately, I can hear you. Yes, sorry about that. All right. The problem was the audio changes I made. This is, so the panel here is actually the audio isn't going out. It's now happening where it's been going out. It reports it's not. All right. So I'm going to assume then that you guys have heard everything so far. Yeah, it's one of those times. It's one of those very rare occasions that it's not my fault. So I don't know why Xander is trying to get me to apologize. Okay. Oh, there's always so. Yeah. We one more second. Yep, there we are. All right. So, as I was saying, there's been a number of people fired or suspended. All right. In trying to fix the problem, I activated a second mic. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to fix the problem. I brought in a second mic, and that may have, how's the audio now? It was fine before, or whatever I did. Yeah, I'm not even sure what I did. I was just trying to fix the audio. So let's see if you guys could. Now it's an audio. Yep. It's in time, not we're gonna work right time. I'll give it another second to see if I've repaired it. So Zandering, how are you doing? Let's see if they can at least hear you. I didn't say it might. Yeah? You're in Kansas now? For fuck's sake. All right, so that's it. I'm just waiting to see. I was actually so busy to try to fix the problem that I wasn't really paying attention to what I was doing, so undoing it maybe. All right, sounds like it's good. All right, I think the problems are fixed. My apologies. So, as I was saying, there's been a number of firings for people that have been refusing to follow through with the various mandates that are now starting to crop up, especially in the health industry. And in Massachusetts, several dozen state troopers have resigned after the police union failed to delay Governor Baker's strict vaccine mandate, which goes into effect October 15th. Quote, I think the debate about mandates is perfectly legitimate to have, but the fastest path back to normalcy is to get more people vaccinated. There's a reason Massachusetts, despite its dense population, has the fourth lowest case count the second lowest hospitalization rate, and the lowest death rates per capita in the country. So, all right, and they don't hear you. I'll get to that one as soon as I finish with the rundown. So we will be covering all that and more tomorrow on our normally scheduled overtime. Today, however, we're going to be discussing the unique brand of brinksmanship that the Republican Party seems to have made now a common occurrence. The passing of the debt ceiling increase, which was always considered must-pass legislation and has never been contentious until 2011, when in a fight with President Obama, congressional Republicans threatened to allow the United States to default by refusing to raise the debt ceiling. Republicans used this threat to negotiate cutting more than $1.2 trillion from the federal budget. Now, that seems like fine. You want to make the budget smaller, but the problem is the budget had already been negotiated. So after the negotiation between Republicans and Democrats, between Congress and the White House had passed, and after they had agreed on a bill, they were post hoc holding the entire U.S. economy hostage for even more cuts. The argument that they used was, well, gee, we're not going to authorize more spending without even more cuts. However, this is a gross misrepresentation of what the debt ceiling actually is. It isn't used to authorize more spending. It is used to pay bills that we have already and debts that we have already incurred. Just the threat of refusing to pay our bills it was enough to downgrade the U.S. credit score for the first time in history from AAA to AA. Now, Mitch McConnell was responsible for that tactic then, as he is now, and even as he has said repeatedly that the U.S. cannot and will not ever default on its debt, he continues to threaten to do so as a bargaining chip against Democrats. Quote, I think some of our members may have thought the default issue was a hostage you might take a chance at shooting. Most of us didn't think that. What we did learn is this: it's a hostage that's worth ransoming. That's what he said in 2011 when he first tried this tactic, and it worked. Well, it is once again what Mitch McConnell is doing now. In June, Democrats attempted to raise the debt ceiling in order to pay for bills that have already accrued. These are debts that we have signed off on and said, yes, we are good for this. We will pay you. With enough votes, the bill failed and along party lines, and yesterday Democrats tried again. Again, all 50 GOP senators voted against it, blocking the bill and blocking the included $20 billion disaster relief for hurricanes, for the recent hurricanes, and aid for Afghan refugees. Chuck Schumer has argued that this bill has always been a bipartisan issue and should easily pass. Indeed, Mitch McConnell again said earlier this month, quote, America must never default. However, after the vote, he added, quote, bipartisanship is not a light switch that Democrats get to flip on when they need to borrow money and then off when they want to spend money. Democrats should have enough votes to pass this on their own, and they should. That is correct. They have enough votes to pass it on their own, so long as the Republicans don't filibuster. They do every time. So no, the Democrats cannot pass this on their own without using reconciliation. Regardless, what I find interesting here is he says that it's the Democrats who are borrowing money. Biden has yet to submit his first budget. Excuse me. And what they are doing now, the Republicans have actually passed 3 of these during the Republican administration, during the Trump administration. So when the Republicans had both the Congress and they had the White House, they passed budgets, they agreed on those budgets, and they went into debt in order to maintain those budgets. And in the first 3 years, they raised the debt limit in order to pay for it. On the 4th year, they didn't. Why not? So that they could pass it on to the Democrats and have them do it. And when the Democrats try, shoot them down and say, no, we are not going to hold you hostage so that we can get the cuts that we want. This is all based on Trump's previous budget. They are not approving a single item of spending, to the best of my knowledge, other than the hurricane relief that was actually passed during a Democratic administration. This is from the previous year's budget. So this Democrats are wanting to spend extra money and he's stopping it is utter horseshit. At any rate, this all came, so again, this came from a Trump administration, which the Republicans approved. They're taking the U.S. economy hostage and threatening to shoot it. In what is now becoming common practice, the Treasury Secretary is reorganizing how the U.S. pays its bills in order to delay the time at which we will have insufficient funds to pay our bills. And she has said now that we will run out of money likely on or about October 15th, at which point we will not be able to, people who have checks from the U.S. will not be able to cash them. We won't have sufficient funds to pay. This sends the message to investors worldwide that the U.S. cannot get its act together, that we are so divided we are willing to hurt other people, people who are investing in this country, investing in Democrats and Republicans alike. We are willing to hurt them to hurt each other. And the people who believe that are, in fact, correct. That is exactly what we're willing to do. This causes investors to become much more skittish about investing in the U.S. and wanting to go places where investing is going to be somewhat more reliable. The idea has now been floated to remove the debt limit indefinitely. The goal of this would be, well, the original goal behind having the debt limit was, in fact, to be able to address what was happening with our economy at the time, but it was not to hold hostage over other people. The idea was not to have infinite political arguments over it, since it has now turned into a political football. The argument is now, and it certainly isn't causing us to address the actual fundamental problem, which has to be addressed when we make the budget. We're not budgeting right now. We're not negotiating the budget right now. That's an entirely separate process. So I doubt that there's going to be any political will, at least on the Republican side, for that, but that is the proposal. So what I'm going to do now is make sure that I'm going to try to get 𝐒𝐤𝐻𝐿𝐷𝑒𝑟𝑖𝑛G's microphone on here. So let's, if I've done this correctly, 𝐒𝐤𝐻𝐿𝐷𝑒𝑟𝑖𝑛G, your mic is now on. How are you?
It's always disturbing. You can just shut me off like a switch.
I don't find that disturbing in the slightest.
I'm sure you don't.
Yeah, no, there is I'm getting an echo for you. I can tolerate the echo so long as it doesn't bother anybody, so long as nobody else is hearing it, and I suspect nobody else is hearing it. So on that assumption, I will go forward. So that's what's going on. 𝐒𝐤𝐻𝐿𝐷𝑒𝑟𝑖𝑛G, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that Republicans are a whole bunch of hypocrites. They claim to care about, debt and government spending unless they're in power, and then in every administration since I've been born, the Republicans have increased the national debt. So I don't believe for a second that they actually care about the increase. They're just using it as a political tool, political grandstanding, to try and get what they want. And it's bad policy.
Well, and of course,
I don't think they should be spending more. I think that we shouldn't be going into debt. The government shouldn't be going into debt at all for mundane reasons. If there's extenuating circumstances, a declared war, or some, a few other things, possibly dealing with a global pandemic, the ability for the government to go into debt isn't important. But if there's no other extenuating circumstances, the government shouldn't be going in debt. If you want to pay for new spending, you should tax the people to pay for that new spending, so the citizenry understands the actual cost to them for these programs. And right now, Republicans love to cut taxes and then still borrow more money and increase the government spending. And people have kind of been lulled into, well, this is what the tax rate should be, and look at all the things that the government can spend money on, and the debt doesn't really matter. And that's proven true thus far. The debt doesn't really seem to matter until it does. So, it's not sustainable in the long run, but nobody seems to be really clear on how long we can do this.
Well,
I think that it's a moral hazard to, pass spending on, for the government to spend money on things that it doesn't tax its people for, because then the people don't have a realistic view of what the true cost of what the government is doing is.
Well, and that's why that's where the brinksmanship comes in, right? The fact is, we don't know how long you can keep doing this. We do know, and I remember when this first happened, people were like, oh, okay, the U.S. credit will never be downgraded. And then it was, because they tried this tactic. Now they're saying, well, we'll never default. Well, then we shouldn't be playing these games if we're not intending to default. Either we're intending to at least put a default on the table, in which case this has teeth, and that's why Democrats are assuming it's got teeth, is because presumably this is on the table, or it's not, in which case, why is it on the table? And the Republicans seem to want it both ways. But I would like to point out, and I think this is an interesting, the only president ever, in a modern president ever, to balance the budget was Clinton. And the largest gains in the budget have been, to the best of my knowledge, most of them have been under Republican administrations. This includes, but is not limited to, the creation of the single largest bureaucracy, government bureaucracy in human history, which is the, oh dear Lord, what is it?
Department of Homeland Security.
Yes, thank you. That's it. Which, and people always say, well, we were attacked. Yeah, but I don't think you needed to create that. In fact, I know for a fact we could have solved most of the problems without creating that. We created a lot more, a lot more bureaucracy from a party that says that this is what they oppose. It's been my experience, Republicans do not oppose government spending. They don't oppose big government. They just have a very different definition of what big and little government is. Military doesn't count when you talk about big government. Having 184 military bases across the globe doesn't count when you're talking about big government or spending. But yeah, it's brinksmanship, and it's daring the other side to destroy this country. Now, I saw an interesting thing in the live chat here. Somebody had said the Democrats should call their bluff. I'm very tempted to say that, because by not calling it, they keep doing this. But on the flip side, the reason this works, the reason this is a hostage worth taking, is because can you really call this bluff? Because they end up, this is what brinksmanship is. They end up in this position where if they let the bluff be called, they can't ever pull a trick like this again. So they're not going to, that's the very definition of brinksmanship. I mean, that's what happened in the 13 days in, was it, I want to say it was November, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Neither side could afford not to go forward. And I don't know what what do you think they should do?
This one, it's really difficult. I mean, they're playing with fire, trying to do this, and and I don't think they're doing so for good reasons. So I don't think that they should be trying to do this, just because they want something cut that they want cut. Going forward, they do need to figure out a solution where we're not continually adding to the federal debt, because eventually that well will run dry, and so, and it won't be pretty when it happens. I mean, you think about all the things that could go wrong now. Well, it can get worse if it fails externally, instead of just from a bunch of political grandstanding. So all of the pain that is anticipated by not raising the debt ceiling and the damage that can be done, especially economically, all of that's going to be worse when it fails. So they need to figure out a solution before it fails, but there's no real political will to do so. And it's, in many cases, political suicide to try. It's like, oh, well, we're going to cut all of these programs from these places that we already kind of consider underfunded. It's like, where do you cut? What do you cut? It's not particularly popular to raise taxes either. Even though there's quite a swell from the lower income people saying, the rich aren't paying their fair share. I'm not entirely sure what they consider their fair share. It's like the top 20% of income earners in the country pay over half the taxes, and half of the people of the country don't pay a net federal tax. So, if you wanted to actually pay for the things that the government is spending money on right now, just so that the debt doesn't increase at all anymore, assuming interest rates stay stay level and don't change, you're going to have to tax everybody who has an income, including the single mother with 3 kids trying to get by on welfare, and that has a part-time job. Her income is going to have to be taxed as well. And you could tax the top 20% of Americans 100% of their income, and you still are going to come up short. That's how much the government spends every year. I mean, they're falling short by over $1 trillion a year now. Let's raise an extra $1 trillion in tax revenue. Where are you going to get it from? Nobody's particularly keen on, or at least the effects of actually raising taxes. You drive wealthy individuals out of your tax jurisdiction. They find other ways and have the means to find other ways to avoid paying those taxes. And the lower end of that tax bracket, where they don't have quite so many resources to try and avoid the taxation or are able to move their assets to a non-taxable jurisdiction, those people are the ones that get hurt. So the whole system is unsustainable and is going to collapse. It's just the Republicans are being kind of childish, throwing a temper tantrum and saying we're going to hold everybody hostage and force this crash early, versus actually try and solve the problem and at least be consistent with our own supposed political beliefs of limited government, fiscal responsibility, etc. And that's one of the things that made me lose any hope with the Republican Party at all. I don't view the Republican Party being any better than the Democratic Party. I think they both have major issues, and neither one of them are actually doing good things for the country. So, when the Patriot Act was passed and the Department of Homeland Security was initially instituted, I was very apolitical. I didn't pay attention to politics. I was in the military at the time and just wasn't paying attention. Now that I am, I can look back on that and say, wow, that was really bad and shouldn't have been done, along with many other things that shouldn't have been done, but are,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a mess, and I don't think that there's the political will to actually fix the mess. I believe we're going to be riding this plane all the way into the side of the mountain until it finally does crash.
What happens if we default? Keeping in mind that
we get
I said this to Pat too, because I was talking to Pat, who's been on a couple times. He's Pat Lawler. He is a historian. So I said, well, I'd like to talk to an economist. Have you ever played one? Have you ever pretended to be an economist? Like, no. I was like, oh, come on our show and you can get to do that. So play the economist. What happens if we default?
The most noticeable thing if we default is interest rates are going to end up rising because we're no longer as secure, and that's going to ripple through and cause a whole bunch of different kinds of damages through the economy, and it's going to hurt. It's going to exacerbate the governmental spending issue too, because they'll have to spend more money to try and secure bonds, or they're going to just simply print more money, and printing money has historically and with good economic basis increased inflation. And either one is bad in the long run.
When you say interest rates, when you say interest rates, which interest rates are going to go up?
Pretty much the prime interest rates that all the other interest rates are based off of, because in order to get any investors to purchase bonds, U.S. bonds, they're going to have to pay a higher interest rate. And bond interest rates are, in my opinion, artificially suppressed at the moment anyway to try and get more people. You also have the Fed is monetizing our debt, is buying U.S. bonds. Of course, they're not calling it monetizing their debt. They're calling it quantitative easing. But it is in effect. It is in fact monetizing our debt. They're buying U.S. bonds. Our Treasury Department, or our U.S. Central Bank, I'm sorry, is buying Treasury bonds to give the U.S. government more money, which it doesn't really already have. So the U.S. Central Bank is essentially creating money digitally just by adding zeros to things, giving it to the government, and then hoping at a later date that the government can retire those bonds without actually having to pay anything out. So the kinds of financial rigmarole that they're going through to try and do this stuff, I mean, there's reasons we had a financial crisis, in 2008. And this kind of thinking and these kinds of things are what led to that. So, it's not going to be pleasant. And if we were to default, then Americans as a general whole are going to have to get used to a reduced standard of living, because the government isn't going to be able to pay a lot of these things, and it's going to trickle throughout all of the U.S. society. Those lower income people that are receiving assistance are going to have very difficult times getting more assistance. Pensioners from public sector pensioners, not private sector, they're going to have issues with their checks. You probably aren't going to see any more COLA increases. There's a whole bunch of little things that go on. It's like at first glance, it doesn't seem like a whole lot happens when you default on your debts, and default is always a possibility. Even if the U.S. saying, well, we never default on our debts, well, it's not kind of accurate. I mean, it's accurate in technicality only. When they removed the gold standard, they were able to inflate or devalue the currency to a point where no, we didn't default. But your dollar certainly wasn't worth what it used to be. It couldn't buy as much. It lost a lot of purchasing power. And that can be very dangerous. That's the danger of inflation. If I get paid $100 this week, and this is what led to the fall of Weimar Germany and led to the rise of Hitler. Weimar Germany suffered catastrophic hyperinflation, and it does serious damage. People were spending their money the day they got it, and they'd have to carry it in wheelbarrows just to take it down to buy a loaf of bread. Zimbabwe has more recently experienced this exact same phenomenon. There were places in Russia that collapsed. I mean, this is what caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. They couldn't keep spending this money. They didn't have it. And eventually it will happen to the United States as well. The question is how bad is it actually going to be when it happens? And nobody really knows, because every time this happens, it happens in a slightly different way with slightly different outcomes. But one thing is Americans are going to have to get used to a reduced standard of living. You're no longer be able to have that nice suburban 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. You're going to have to downgrade to a 1-bedroom, and you're going to have to double everybody up in a room. So, it's not pleasant. It's not nice. And the fact that the Republicans are flippantly, in my opinion, playing with, the possible economic collapse because the government just totally screws everything over, that's not something you play with. And your idea of the missile crisis is a good one, because you have two sides that can't really lose this argument, and there's significant potential danger if they don't resolve it in the right way.
Well, and that's the interesting. I mean, yeah, and Republicans really, yeah, it's okay. So I want to hit a couple quick things. First, I want to make a clarification because I like to get gotchas on his andering all the time, so I listen very carefully to what he says. I wouldn't listen to him for any other reason. He did not actually claim that this is what caused the 2008 crisis. He said it was shenanigans like this. It was messing with the economy like this, and I would concur with him, which was that it was an artificial attempt to it was putting the hands on the economic scales. In particular, started by Clinton by trying to get every American in a home, which is a great. I'm thrilled. I think that's a great idea, but you can't, unfortunately, do it by upsetting the balance by putting your hand on the scale, because the scale will push back. So it was. I think his Andering's point was it was these kinds of shenanigans. That's correct. Is that correct? Is Andering?
Yes, that's what I mean. It wasn't trying to. It wasn't a fight over the debt ceiling that caused that. It was in response to like the monetizing the debt. That they create these very complex financial instruments that aren't necessarily economically sound, but work as long as there's confidence. Then as soon as confidence flees, the whole thing falls apart. Kind of like how a Ponzi scheme works initially. But it's these kinds of economic manipulations, financial manipulations, that lead to crisis. Because people get over greedy and they're like, hey, this works great. And it's like, yeah, but it's not really financially fundamentally sound thinking to be doing this. Yeah, but it's working great.
Yeah. Jesus,
oh, okay. Yeah. And until the point it doesn't.
So the next, yeah, and they will, and that's the what's going to happen here is they will blame the Democrats, and they've set it up, and I think there's a very good shot that they'll be successful in blaming the Democrats because of the way this is set up. So, when the Democrats refuse to cut, they're going to say, look, we were arguing for responsibility, and they refuse, and that's why they didn't pass it on the 4th year of the Trump administration. They waited and pushed everything to here to maximize the leverage against the Democrats, which, well, I understand there is some of that on all sides. On all sides, Democrats do it too. This is you don't do it with the debt ceiling. You don't do it with something that is critical. So I want to say, so what I think the problem is when you raise, especially the prime rate would go up, but it's all lending to and from the United States. And the problem is that it affects all lending within the United States. So what ends up happening is a number of things. First of all, when the U.S. wants to borrow money, it costs us more to borrow money. That means we get less for the dollar when we try to buy things in other countries or when we try to just sell debt to other countries so that we can build things ourselves. The second thing is a lot of the debt that's currently held is held at a variable rate. If that rate goes up, that means that the current debt that we have goes up without us spending anything. We don't have to spend it. If our credit drops the next day, we owe more money because all of the interest rates on the debt we currently have has now gone up. So we owe money. Yes, please.
Also on that, not only do we have variable interest rate debt, but a lot of the debt that we hold is short-term debt, which we have to renew yearly.
Which means
that we're, a rise in interest rates.
Good point. Very good point. So right off the bat, if we default, the current debt that we have expands. It grows because the interest rate on that debt has gone up. Our ability to finance things going forward goes down because if we have $1,000 that we're going to put into a project and the interest rate was 4%, and it goes up to 6, 7, 8%. Yeah, that's not a huge amount in a really short period of time, but that's money that still has to get paid back, and that's 8% less money that you have just off of the first year to actually put into something else. And since you're going to have to pay it, unless you're paying that back in the first year, that's going to accrue to a lot more money and a lot less we can spend it on. Then, when you talk about businesses inside the U.S., they get their money from banks. Banks lend out at the same rate, which means if you are trying to start a small business, if you are the head of GE, who, by the way, during 2008, the head of GE, 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐿, had to call Henry Paulson and say, listen, I can't pay my bills on Monday. General Electric was the first company, basically every U.S. company, well, I think 2/3 of the U.S. companies were starting to face this problem, but they were the first ones to address it specifically, which was because of the way the crisis was hitting the banks, companies like GE, their paychecks were no longer any good. If someone got a paycheck from General Electric, one of the most stable one of the most stable businesses in the country at the time, if you work for GE, you get a paycheck, you go to the bank and you cash it, it's no good. How many people are going to keep going to work if they don't get paid? We were less than 24 hours away. Bush actually did one right thing and saved our asses by getting Congress on board to do that final deal. Without that, the U.S. would have suffered the worst economic collapse in U.S. history. Now, that's the kind of thing we're looking at possibly in a default. It really depends. I think as Andrew brought up a good point, which is we don't know. We've never gone that far. So a lot of this is theoretical. But it's going to be serious, and it's going to be extraordinarily bad. And at a minimum, I think, as Andrew, you called it, our standard of living drops dramatically. That's what they're playing with, and it affects everybody. There is Democrats, Republicans, they're holding the entire country hostage. So, Xander, why don't we just print up more money and pay for it? Is that even possible?
Sure, it's possible. Yeah, you can print we have a printing press. We can print as much money as we want. The question becomes, do we want to remain the world's reserve currency? And I would argue that we kind of sort of need to. One of the reasons why fuel is a lot cheaper in the United States than it is in many other countries around the world is because we own the reserve currency. We don't have to worry about exchange rates because oil is priced in U.S. dollars. So we're buying it direct. We don't have to worry about any exchange rates or the exchange rate suddenly changing. So, you can just print more money, but when you do that, you increase the supply of money, and we already know that there are certain laws of economics that hold true regardless of any kind of shenanigans done with it, and the law of supply and demand is one of them. If you increase the supply but don't equally increase the demand, you'll have a devaluation of whatever supply you increased. So if we flood the economy with money to pay the government's debts and don't have any way of removing said money quickly, you're going to cause inflation. And inflation hurts everybody. And if you're printing enough, to cover our debts, for example, because we can't raise the debt ceiling, you're going to have to print a lot of money. And that runs into the dangers of triggering a cascading effect, which causes hyperinflation, which means that you paid $5 for a loaf of bread today, and literally by tomorrow, you'll be paying $50. And the next day, you'll be paying $500. because interest rates can change overnight, not just yearly. So, and of course, this happened in the Weimar Republic. It's what caused the Weimar Republic to collapse, and it has caused the collapse of several different countries. Brazil and Zimbabwe. Both of them experienced hyperinflation problems. Even Venezuela is experienced hyperinflation problems because when the oil money ran out, the government printed more money, and they caused a hyperinflation issue there as well. Hyperinflation also tends to lead to shortages of just about everything because things become so expensive. And the real danger comes in once you start getting that train rolling, it can be almost impossible to stop. Yeah.
And
so, it's very dangerous to just print the money to do that.
And just to be clear, so it sounds backwards, and a lot of people, it confuses people. And we're talking about money, and the value of the money is deflating. The money is worth less and less. But when they talk about inflation, they're usually talking about prices. So if you hear about inflation or deflation, people usually talk about prices. If the value of the money goes down, then the prices go up, so that they get the same value for whatever it is. You just have to use an increased number of dollars to. So the prices are going up. The prices are inflating because the money is deflating. So confuses the living daylights out of everybody. But yeah, so it's called inflation, but that's because the prices are going up. The value of the money is going down, and yeah, because we're printing more of it. So when we print a huge ton of money, the value of every dollar that you have drops. You're not getting any of that money. The money is going out into circulation. It's being used to pay the bills. But since you don't get any of that money, if you double the amount of money that's in circulation, you have the value of the money that people currently hold. So if the U.S. doubles the amount of money in circulation by printing money, then if you have $1,000 in your bank yesterday, you still have that $1,000 today, but it can buy half as much. The value is half, despite the actual number being the same. It's
generally better to look at it. Yeah, it's the best way I found of looking at it is in terms of purchasing power. And we always and we talk about this. What did this cost in 1918, for example? Like what was the cost of a suit in 1918? Well, it cost about $20 an ounce of gold. This is one of the reasons why gold is pegged as a hedge against inflation, is because gold has historically remained incredibly consistent in its purchasing power. What you could buy for an ounce of gold, and in 1918 you could buy a suit for $20, which was an ounce of gold. That's why we have, $20 double eagles.
And let me interrupt real quick. I don't want to derail you, but one of the reasons it's such a good hedge is because more gold isn't being created. Nobody's coming in and saying I'm going to create a whole bunch more gold and flood the market. So it ends up being very stable.
Mostly. I mean, they do mine more, but the reason that it's remained so stable is because gold is finite. It's hard. It's expensive to get out of the ground, and the new mines and the new gold that they're able to extract from those mines has been roughly keeping up with the inflation of the population. So, gold has remained fairly stable price-wise. And this may not hold true in the future, but it has held true in the past, which is why so many people like buying gold and why it's considered a hedge against inflation. When inflation fears start spiking up, people tend to buy more gold stock, mining stocks, etc. But, today, an ounce of gold is just shy of $2,000. Well, how much does a good suit cost today? Oh, about $2,000. So the purchasing power of gold has remained remarkably stable, for the last several hundred years. But what your dollar can buy, because remember, it used to be $20 was an ounce of gold. Well, now it's just shy of 2,000. I mean, and that fluctuates quite a lot as well due to speculation. So we have lost. The dollar has lost purchasing power. When we talk about, how much did a brand new car, I had an older Mustang. It was like a '68 Mustang. And I looked at the title and it was like, oh, wow, this cost, $3,800. And, all of these, when you look at the news and stuff, they have to convert money to, okay, well, how much was $3,800 in today's money? And the reason for that is inflation. The monetary supply expands, the amount you can purchase with the same individual dollar is reduced, and that's generally a bad thing. If it happens very slowly, like is historically happened, if you take the entirety of the history of the United States, there have been areas like the 1970s, you ended up with stagflation. You had a high inflation rate and wages weren't rising to compensate for that. That's called stagflation, which means you're effectively getting a pay cut every year. So, things like that, trickle through the economy and can wreak an enormous amount of damage. And you have to have quite a lot of political guts to stand up and do the right thing, because doing the right thing to avert a future disaster is going to be painful in the moment now. It's going to hurt a lot of people, and that's going to have an immediate reaction now, versus, sometime in the future, this is going to eventually fail. But doing something about it now is going to create an immediate negative reaction towards me, because I've just hurt a lot of people, and those people are feeling the pain now. And the pain in the future from the system just eventually coming apart is a theoretical thing that nobody's actually feeling. So, and most people don't care. I mean, economics can be very boring. So why would you? I mean, it took me a long time to get into economics because I thought it was boring too, until I realized how important it is to the success of civilization.
Didn't we just have this conversation on COVID and the lockdowns? Oh, dear Lord. Okay, I'm going to need to actually read a couple super chats real quick, but we literally had what was it? We that conversation with. Okay, so let me do a couple super chats here. $5, Sinister Porpoise. What variable type is the interest rate? She means as a programmer, of course, integer, real, whatever. But haven't the Republicans caused an error by dividing by zero intelligence? Oh, Sinister. That was very partisan. That was a low blow. It was also very funny. Okay, so Nick, there are many more nuances here. It's not as if the U.S. will undergo a general default worldwide. That's a good point. That's actually a very good point by Pat, who is the guy I was saying earlier. We kind of wanted him to play the economist, and now he's willing to do it, but he wouldn't. Okay. Which is, we don't default on every single debt the instant it goes. It's not like one day we can pay all our bills and the next day we can't pay any of them. One day we can pay all our bills and the next day we can pay all minus one or two. And it spirals from that. And because all it has to do is, all that's meant by a default is that there ends up being bills that we are just incapable of paying, that are due,
or paying fully,
that are due, and then what happens is that's just called a default, and what the catastrophic consequences aren't necessarily the default itself, although that itself is really bad, but it is the consequence of a lack of faith in the U.S. economy that causes the interest rates on lending to the U.S. to go up. That's extraordinarily serious. But I think that is important nuance. And then from Pat, Discovering Ancient History with Pat Lowinger, $2, my donation to the In Time Relief Fund. You, sir, are a gentleman. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your support. So thank you. I appreciate it. So
on day one, like say October 16th, there's not really going to be, you're going to see a lot of shift, because things like the stock market, things like bond buying, a lot of that there's a huge confidence component in those things. So on day one, you can see shocks to those areas that rely on quite a lot of confidence that indeed this is going to continue working into the future. And when people lose that confidence, you can send quite a few shocks through different financial institutions, financial areas. But as far as real world effects, not going to be very many. What it's going to cause are ripples. And those ripples, as they travel through the different economy and around the world, because we now have a pretty much a global economy, we're all kind of reliant on each other's economies. One of the realizations to come out of the 2008 is how tied we are to a lot of other economies. It's going to send ripples, and those ripples will slowly accrue negative effects. And eventually, if the ripples are allowed to go on long enough, and you generate enough new ripples, because every day that goes on that you haven't solved or addressed the issue, you create a few more ripples, and eventually you're going to end up with tsunamis rolling around. It takes time, and they have to go in certain areas, and people's behavior as well. What do people actually do? This is why it's so hard to accurately predict exactly what's going to go on, and that's why different countries collapse in different ways, or economies collapse in different ways, and different things become the catalyst for causing the dominoes to completely fall. Well, and it doesn't necessarily mean, there's been economic collapses, like Brazil's still around, Zimbabwe's still around. The pound sterling collapsed in Britain. Great Britain is still around. It's not like it may necessarily be the end of the world, but you're going to have, and we had an economic collapse in the United States too. We called it the Great Depression. But look at all of the suffering. We're removed enough from it, and I don't think it's taught well enough that you really see the kind of suffering that went on during that, and the thousands of people who actually died from it. There's not a nice big list like you see like in wartime. You can see nice neat figures and all this stuff, and a lot of times in situations like that, it's really hard to track what the actual damage was versus people who might have died anyway. So these things can be very hard to track, because there's economies have become so complicated with so many different sectors, and they're so interlocked that a lot of people don't really understand exactly how everything works together. That's why we ended up with a 2008 financial crisis, because people couldn't look through what the negatives, or didn't bother to look through what the potential negatives could be. But even the people who were looking at them said, well, it's going to be bad, but we don't know exactly how. It's kind of the same issue with defaulting on the U.S. debt. It'll be bad, but we don't know exactly how bad.
Well, and it's actually similar to the COVID problem, which is we don't know how many people have died. You can say how many people have died of COVID. What's the actual mortality rate? If you get it, what's the chances that you're going to die? But there have been a lot of deaths as a result of our failure to treat COVID, because now if you have a heart attack and you're waiting for 12 hours to get into the ER in Austin, Texas, you died because there was a pandemic. You didn't die of COVID, but if there hadn't have been the pandemic, if we had solved it, you'd probably still be alive because you would have gotten medical attention. So it becomes very difficult to parse out the consequences. I do want to say, too, that we're going to need to wrap things up, but we got another super chat. Thank you. I'll get to that in a second. The confidence in the economy is everything. The reality is, and I've heard many times, and Pat brought up something else that I think is interesting, but I've heard many times that, the dollar is a faux currency, which of course it is. There aren't many non-faux currencies. People say, well, gold, we should get back on the gold standard because that's not a faux currency. Yes, it is. It is absolutely a faux currency. But nonetheless, the reality is the dollar has only the value that we believe it has, only the value that we agree that it has. If tomorrow everybody said, you know what, I don't think the dollar has any value, it's not going to have any value anymore. There are some things for which that's not true. Air, food, water, land, they're always going to have value because we have to have them. But everything else has the value that we say it does, and that is confidence. That's the definition of confidence. And if confidence goes down in the dollar, confidence goes down in the U.S. ability to back the dollar, the power of the dollar goes down, and 90% of the U.S. powerhouse is based on the power of that dollar. Our ability to maintain those bases, which I don't think we should have, but we do. If you're a big fan of those bases, and you think we should have 182, 84 military bases across the world, that's done by the power of the U.S. dollar. That's the economy that apparently it's okay to kill Grandpa for, and Grandpa's happy to die for the U.S. economy. Okay, fine, but then why are you holding it hostage? I don't know. So I'm going to want to do a quick wrap up of just sort of where we stand on all of this. There's Jake 4D, $5. If it was a low blow, do you think the GOP got the joke? No, and I think they wouldn't care.
Yeah. And I actually agree with you. One thing I would like to point out real quick,
Please.
I guess kind of my summation or my conclusion to the whole issue is one of the things in the Bretton Woods Accords that we got together, which pretty much completed the decoupling of the U.S. dollar to gold, completely going off the gold standard back in the 70s. One of the things is the U.S. agreed to not play financial shenanigans, to screw around with it, and in return, the world would treat the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency. We're not really living up to our end of the bargain. Keeping the U.S. dollar stable, not playing shenanigans, being fiscally responsible with our currency. And it's showing there's been pushback around the world, especially in the area of China and somewhat of Russia, trying to come up with like a basket of commodities to replace the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, to something to pin the value of things to. And that's one of the largest dangers with doing crap like this. You're screwing around with the confidence in the U.S. dollar. And if there's enough confidence lost, especially worldwide, the U.S. doesn't, United States citizens don't necessarily have to lose confidence in the dollar, and they probably won't, because we're pretty much ingrained since birth that a dollar is a dollar and is going to be worth a dollar always and forever. And most people still believe that. But around the world, you can look and see, because they have to deal with exchange rates, because the dollar is the reserve currency, and when they want to buy international commodities, they have to exchange their currency into U.S. dollars. So they can see immediately when the U.S. dollar is being screwed with, and the rest of the world doesn't take lightly to that, because it directly affects their economies, their purchasing power. So we've seen pushback against people accepting the dollar as the reserve currency, and the Republicans are doing absolutely zero favors in maintaining the dollar as a reserve currency. And you want to see the greatest reduction in the cost or in the standards of living and the ability of the U.S. to project its power around the world for good or ill. Remove it as a reserve currency, and you're going to see like another depression. That is not a good scenario. And the fact that the Republicans would play around with that, for political grandstanding, what amounts to political grandstanding, I find reprehensible.
Well, I think that puts it very well. So for those of you who have not joined since the beginning, in 2011, for the first time ever, Mitch McConnell heading the majority in Congress, in the Senate, decided to hold the debt ceiling hostage. Now, the debt ceiling is just how we pay our bills. It has nothing to do with the budget. The budget is a separate process. It seems like it has something to do with the budget, right? Because it's like, well, it has to do with the budget. I mean, you couldn't have debt if you hadn't spent the money. But that process, which had always just been one of those must-pass legislations that just says, we're going to pay our bills, said, no, wait, we're not going to pay our bills because we disagree with these bills and they shouldn't have been made, and until more is cut from the budget. Now, again, this sort of makes sense, and you say to yourself, well, they should be tied together, except that there's already a budget process where Democrats and Republicans sit down, Congress and the White House sit down, and they discuss the budget, and they come to an agreement. The Democrats, the Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, had already agreed to a budget. And having agreed to that budget, having that money been spent, then said, we're not going to pay the bills until we cut even more. And they already agreed to it. These are the bills that they agreed to, and they're not going to pay the bills that they signed off on until even more is cut. This is holding the entire country hostage, because if we do not pay those bills, it affects the U.S. credit rating, and it affects our ability to buy and spend across the globe. And it affects every American. And if you're curious about how, that's basically what this entire show has been about. Go back, rewind, watch the show. It worked in as much as he was able to hold it hostage, and then Democrats caved and gave them the cuts that they wanted. They are doing this again after 3 years in the Trump administration of rubber stamping this, when the Republicans were in charge. As soon as the Democrats are in charge, well, we don't like the budget, and you guys can't just spend anything you want to, except we're not paying for the Democratic budget. The Democratic budget hasn't been enacted yet. Biden hasn't even been a year in office. This is the Trump budget that we are paying for, the budget that Mitch McConnell, when he was the majority leader, signed off on and agreed to, and he is now saying, I don't like it, and unless you guys cut more from your budget, not his budget, which he rubber stamped, your budget, we're not going to approve of this. And he is holding the entire U.S. economy hostage. We are going to find out roughly what's going to happen on roughly October 15th, when the U.S. runs out of money to pay its bills. We're going to see. The Democrats are in a terrible position. If the Democrats capitulate, it just encourages the Republicans to do this again. If they don't, they risk a default, and the Republicans successfully blaming them for it. This kind of brinksmanship is literally with the economic health of the entire country. And honestly, we're supposed to be Americans first. And the idea that we would hold a gun to our collective heads, to all of us, and say, give us what we're demanding. A cut in the budget, which maybe the budget should be cut, but that's what we discussed when we set the budget. Happens every year. Do it now, or we kill everybody. I think Zendering's right. It's absolutely atrocious. It's disgusting, and we'll see where this goes, but this is extraordinarily serious news. It was serious then, and we will have to see where it goes. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Zandering and I will be hosting a Dr. Conspiracy, and he is going to be talking to us about conspiracy theories, what they are, why they're so attractive to people, how to debunk them, and discuss a whole bunch of common conspiracy theories, and maybe some you've never heard of before. That will be tonight on In Time at 9 p.m. Tomorrow at 9 p.m. we will have Overtime. We'll see. Joe is still on vacation, so if Joe wants to come in and can manage that, we will be having Joe. If not, Zandering may be covering for that one as well. And then we will have After Dark on Friday, 10 p.m. If you've gotten this far, hopefully you've liked the show. Please like and subscribe, and we will keep you guys all abreast of what's going on as we learn more. Please don't hesitate to join our Discord. You can talk to me, ask me questions, ask a lot of people who are smarter than I am, who are in our Discord and are keeping everybody up to date on this and a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on. No, the East Coast is not going to get wiped out in a tsunami. Just FYI, there isn't enough mass in that volcano to do it. I have no idea how and why that's spreading, but let's nip that one in the bud. We're going to be okay. But we're covering that and everything else that we can. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Zandering, so much for coming on such short notice. Appreciate it. Always love having you on.
That's been great.
And we will see you guys in just a few hours with Dr. Conspiracy. Thank you all.